Okay. People are still joining, but I think we'll get going. We're nearly, well, just over 100 people register. Got over half on now, so we'll get going. We're going to run this in a fairly relaxed way, so we've allocated an hour to this, but I don't think the presentation will take anything like that. Maybe not even half an hour. So I think if people want to ask questions as we go along, please do either drop something in the chat or put your hand up. Whoever's not presenting or talking at the time will try and keep tabs on who's got a hand up and whatnot. As I said, we will record the session and email you all a copy of it later. And I think that's probably about it in terms of housekeeping. I'll do a little quick intro to the session, and then the speakers will introduce ourselves and our organisations, and then we'll get going. So we've put this together as part of Leeds Digital Festival's sort of mini festival focused on topics of sustainability. Seeing it as an opportunity to sort of take stock of some of the work that we've been involved in and some of the things that we're seeing driving a lot of sort of conversation around our data and the services offered by WPI, where Joe's from. So we thought we'd just take the opportunity to take a step back and present some of those initial sort of observations about the road to net zero. And it's sort of obvious in the early work that we're doing that the reality of the implementation of this is being driven very much at the sort of local level, and local government bodies are starting to think very seriously about what this means. And there's a number of challenges involved in this for businesses, communities, and local authorities. So we've sort of trying to summarize those into 5 principal points, which we'll talk you through, and we'll share some early thoughts on sort of how to go about addressing those. Okay, so hopefully you can all see my screen okay. I'm Alex Craven. I'm Chief Exec and co-founder of the Data City. We combine company website text with company financials information to enable our customers to understand what companies do. So as part of that, we're able to look at sort of non-standard classifications of business activity to do things like classify new sectors of the economy, of which net zero and the green economy is definitely one. Doesn't exist in the standard industry classifications you're offered when you set your company up. So I'm going to sort of introduce the high level stuff as a data provider, and then I'm going to hand over to Joe, who will just do a quick introduction into WPI economics in a second, who's going to take you through some of the more detailed sort of information on each of those points, and a little bit of case study, sort of real data from some of the work we've done with some of our clients. And then, like I said, happy to take questions as we go, and we'll also be running a Q&A session at the end. Joe, if you want to introduce yourself and WPI.
Yeah, great. Cheers, Alex. So I'm Joe Ahern. I'm Head of Policy Consulting at WPI Economics, as it says there. And if you haven't heard of us, we're a specialist economics and public policy consultancy, and we bring together research, evidence, analysis to produce work for a range of clients, everything from FTSE 100 companies to local authorities, charities. And we're interested in bringing all that stuff together to have a social impact and make a difference. We're particularly interested in the green economy, and particularly sort of the political economy, if you like, of net zero, somewhere where we're developing a specialism, and also this exciting partnership with the Data City and a few other organisations, as we'll talk to.
So those observant of you will notice on the slide preceding this, we had a number of logos. So we've got the Data City and WPI Economics on there. But WPI, in the work we've been doing, we've sort of formed a partnership of spanning sort of job data from Burning Glass, business activity data from K-Matrix, and business classification data from ourselves, with the sort of wrapper of the WPI Economist Consulting and Economist Brain in these. So this seminar is brought to you by all of those, but just myself and Joe presenting today. Okay, so by way of introduction, So the green transition is something that's likely to have an impact across a wide range of jobs and sectors. I think it's probably fairly obvious, but in analysis of that, it's clear that it's a complex situation that's going to require a combination of investment and efficiencies, and the savings in low carbon technologies will result in a net increase, we think, in jobs overall. But there is going to be a transition needed from the high carbon intensive economy to the green economy. And this session is mainly focused on sort of digging into the detail of those challenges. So here are the 5 hard truths as we've set them. So the first is that the path to net zero will place many jobs at risk of change or cause them to disappear completely. To meet the objective, the sector must grow by, and I'm going to go into the detail of that a little bit, because we've done the data for one geography, but it's by no means representative of the entire country. And I think the key observation here is it's significant growth. It will vary by geography, and I think the sort of big highlight here is it looks like this sector needs to grow by at a faster rate than the digital sector has grown. So I think we've all got a feel for how quickly the digital sector has grown, but it looks like we need this sector to grow by at least the same, if not more. Key challenges to those trying to grasp these issues is the lack of clear definitions of the key concepts. So, what are green jobs and skills? What are net zero and green sectors? There isn't a sort of single thing you can hang your hat on. So we'll talk a little bit about how we've approached that as a challenge. I guess it's fairly obvious, but it mustn't be understated that every local authority faces different challenges. If you're the London boroughs, that's a very different situation to the local authorities running perhaps rural economy situations. And then that all results in a sort of need for certainty. If we're going to achieve or make a difference in the first 4 points, then people need to be able to act with confidence to invest in education and skills and innovation to stimulate the industrial sectors and the supply chain development. And it's not just a case of saying that we need to raise venture capital to invest in firms, because those firms need access to the people that are going to build those firms. So it really is a whole supply chain view, not just an industrial supply chain view. Okay. So, Joe, I'm running these ones, or are you going to jump in these ones?
Yeah, I think these. I'll leave these ones to you.
Yeah, cool. So number 1, 11% of employment is in high carbon sectors, many of which will change significantly or are at risk. Even in central London, where only 4% of jobs are in high carbon sectors, this represents 137,000 jobs. However, if the net zero economy grows like it needs to in order to achieve our objective, there should actually be a net increase in the number of jobs available in the market. So the stats here are the sort of difference between national and local authority positions, just to highlight the point we made previously. To meet the objective, the sector must grow by 8% per year from now until 2030 in London. So, I mean, that's an interesting statistic. And given that London has a smaller percentage of high carbon jobs, it'd be interesting to see how that plays out in other geographies, and then continue to grow to 2050. So that's double the rate of growth for the digital sector in the decade leading to the pandemic. So that's substantial. We mustn't underestimate the amount of growth that's required in order to meet this objective. There's no single definition of the key concepts. So as I touched in the introduction, what are green jobs and skills? And the reason this matters is because for anyone who's interested in these issues, in order to understand whether or not you can meet your net zero objectives, you need to be able to understand what your start point is. How far are you away from being able to supply the talent that's required to grow the industries that you need in your local and national supply chain? And there's possibly even export potential stuff here that needs to be considered. So how can we baseline where we are in order to actually look at the size of the task ahead of us, and then obviously importantly, how can we measure our progress if we can't even measure our baseline. So it's really critical that we agree definitions around these things so that we do at least have data points that we can track, hopefully that will result in a more efficient direction of resources toward achieving the objectives, and also the ability to measure our progress toward them. What are net zero and green sectors, and how will they change over time? There's obviously a massive technology dimension to this and the impact of technology on these sectors. How do we track emissions? How do we track progress? And how do we predict and manage the transition? Prediction is key here. We've got to be looking forward to the jobs that we will lose and making sure that those people are able to find employment in our emerging economy sectors. Every authority faces different challenges. The percentage of employment in high carbon sectors differs greatly. So we've already highlighted 4% central London versus national averages between 9 and 12%. Growth of green jobs not geographically aligned to the decline of high carbon jobs. So it's not necessarily as simple to say that you're going to lose a load of high carbon manufacturing jobs, but your local net zero supply chain is going to immediately absorb people with manufacturing job skill sets into their businesses. One of the key challenges for local authorities is to work out what the growth in their net zero and green job sector looks like, and compare the skills of that requirements of those sectors with the skills of the people losing jobs in the high carbon sectors, and work out whether there is any overlap, and if there isn't, what they're doing about that. We need to look at those clusters and see how much of it needs to be replicated in every geography versus our more of a national pattern. And obviously the entire supply chain needs certainty. So each sector and its stakeholders need certainty to invest. Otherwise there will be a tendency to lag and just continue doing what we've always done in the way we've always done it. And we need to stimulate that supply chain and the education and skills side of things in order to meet the needs of that supply chain once it commits to that direction. Yeah, so for instance, the point we've raised there is what is the solution that we're going to arrive at for low carbon heating? You know, are we going with air source heat pumps and so on, or something else? There are wildly differing technologies which require wildly differing skill sets and different supply chains vying for market share, which is great in a lot of ways, but also hard to plan for from a skills and education point of view and just transition point of view. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Joe now. I'm going to act as the slide nudger. Hopefully keep pace. Over to you, Joe.
Great stuff. Yeah, so talk through a little bit about how we've sort of approached some of these questions in practice, and then I'll talk through a case study, which is our work in London, particularly looking at the central London economy, some of the bits we've touched on anyway. So key questions that we sort of set out to address with some of these pieces of work that we've done for London and are sort of doing with some other clients now. First of all, that question of definition, that, as Alex has highlighted, really feeds into other things. What is a green job? What is a green skill? You need to answer that before you can start measuring, extrapolating, etc. Quantification, so how many green jobs are there in a specific geography based on that definition. Projections, then, how many will there be in the future, with obviously certain caveats, because there's no crystal ball and it's about having a sensible projection. And what skills are needed for those jobs. So how do you then look at what is the likely skills pipeline that's needed for those jobs? Where are the jobs that are at risk of decarbonisation? So which bits of the economy are you going to see that there's potentially jobs disappearing or changing significantly? And then the implication of all on that for employment and skills provision. How do you make sure that you have an efficient transition, a just transition from all of that? Alex, yep, cheers. So firstly, just this question of definition. The first thing to say, there's no sort of grand kind of overall objective definition of this is green, this is not green. There are clearly a number of, if you like, existing technocratic data sets that are collected by different bits of government, and there's other countries have different ways of measuring this. But ultimately, you can't divorce the definition of green jobs from the purpose for which you're defining it. So when we've looked at this in detail before, what we found that is that the need to define green jobs arises from the practical questions that policymakers face in delivering net zero and environmental goals. So how the labour market going to change? How's the labour market going to change for the net zero transition, and what skills providers need to plan for? And so you effectively define green, if you like, for the purpose of that. So what we arrived at is something that's drawn heavily from the Green Jobs Task Force, which is what we call a mission-based definition of green jobs. So green jobs are those jobs that facilitate meeting net zero and broader environmental goals. And we've done that, as you'll see in the Central London context, adapted that to a local context. And we'll do that with kind of any particular geographies that are looking at this. For the purposes of London, we looked at 11 missions overall. Alex, slide, sorry. Cool. And this is just a bit of a case study then on the London boroughs. So small bit of background to this work, which is that it started off just being for Central London Forward. I'm going to talk through the data for now. If you haven't heard of CLF, they're the sub-regional partnership for the boroughs of Central London. And we worked also with the Institute of Employment Studies on this, who did some of the skills analysis as well. We also worked with Alex and the team and K-Matrix. I'll just say about this before I talk through this, which is clearly the quantification, and this is based on that mission-based definition that I talked about. I'm happy to sort of take lots of questions, take any questions on methodology. I think there's probably aspects of the methodology that are probably best taken offline in more detail. It's also covered in the report, just because there are lots of different people and lots of different organisations on this, and I might not be able to cover off absolutely everything in a satisfactory way, but I will do my best. But just on this quantification then, you can see here that the sectors that we're looking at in Central London, and it's quite, I think it's quite stark in terms of the picture it paints of Central London Forward as an area, and how it's quite distinct from other bits of the country. The main big notable thing is that it's got a massive green finance sector. So it's got a huge green finance sector, and that is obviously going to be substantially bigger than other geographies and other jurisdictions. And that's clearly a lot of that's clustered around City of London and the sector that's there. So that's something that's pretty significant about Central London's economy. And clearly there's big employment coming from some other sectors that you'd expect to be probably more consistent across different geographies, including power and homes and buildings. Those are big in terms of absolute numbers and jobs, and big in terms of just being a proportion of overall employment and the proportion of green jobs. And 147,000 in total, we're saying, as of 2020.
Got a question in the chat, Joe. So we've got from Chris has asked two, actually. He's asked, how did you arrive at this estimate percentage?
I'll cover that when I get to the projection slide.
Yeah, and then he's saying, so far we have high carbon jobs and green jobs. By your definitions, is it just one or the other, or is there some middle ground? So
it's a very good question, and ultimately, I think there's two things to respond to that with. One is that, as I said, there's potentially pieces of work you can do where it's useful to have more middle ground and having sort of lime green jobs, if you like, or sort of jobs that are somewhat green. But I mean, for the purposes of this analysis, we did distinguish, because of this sort of, what we say is we're looking at the skills pipeline to support the green jobs, and we're looking at also how do we manage the effect of these high carbon sectors. We picked this approach. There's also a bit later on where we look at the net impact of the overall economy, which takes into account all jobs. So yeah, I think for the purposes of the mission-based definition, we're looking at kind of green jobs specifically. It's also worth saying that when we say jobs, we're saying full-time equivalents, basically. So it could be a proportion of a job, if you like. Cool. And then just how that fills into skills analysis. So you can see then that the sort of exceptional nature of Central London as being this hub for green finance is that a huge proportion of the green jobs in Central London are in high-level managerial, professional, and associate professional occupations, much bigger than the UK. And that includes jobs in the power sector. So it's worth thinking about the fact that you might sort of imagine people working in the power sector as being high-vis people on offshore wind farms. There's lots of people working in the power sector in London, but not necessarily in those sorts of roles, in sort of more professional roles. And then you have got those sort of more skilled craft workers as well in large numbers working in the homes and building sector. Although the homes and building sector is a bit different in central London as to other bits of London, other bits of the UK, as we can go on for. 3/4 of central London residents in green jobs have degrees. Again, that's pretty high, and the vast majority of workers in the power and green finance consultancy sector as graduates, as are half of those in homes and buildings. And there's about 14,000 learners in FE and in apprenticeships. That's just FE and over 19 in the relevant subject areas. So then I'll go into this scenario for the projections, and just coming back to Chris's question, which I think is a fair one. The thing about these projections is they are projections rather than forecasts. But the work that we've drawn on to come up with these percentages is particularly pieces of work for the Climate Change Committee, given the importance of the Climate Change Committee in sort of laying down the pathways for growth in these sectors, and also some other work for the LGA that was done, I think, by Acuity, and then I think there's some other sort of local, more specific, sector-specific things in there as well to come up with some sensible projections. The first thing, we've said it again, but it needs to be stressed a lot. The first thing about this growth is it's very high. This is, we'd be looking at very significant growth, particularly to 2035, and then beyond that, also significant growth, but particularly in the run up to 2035, the sort of, if you like, stimulus effect of big growth in terms of buildings through retrofit, etc., is a big driver of growth in jobs, and then beyond that, significant growth as well. The other key thing is that clearly there is considerable uncertainty here, and we want to be very straightforward about that in the analysis. There are such a broad range of different sort of policy and other factors that can feed into the number of green jobs that need to be taken into account here. So it is important when we're projecting that we have 3 scenarios that account for these different types of variations here. Cool, thanks, Alex. And then just looking at what does the scenarios for growth that we've set out here imply for skills provision. So the fastest growth rate is projected for skilled craft workers, and we're sort of seeing it in this report and for some of the other sectors. Skilled craft workers are an area where there's a big sort of concern, I think, in terms of skills shortages in the future. However, the largest increase in number of workers is projected among associate professionals. And there's a need to replace workers who retire or leave the labour market. So what's called replacement demand, which at the moment we suggest represents 1/3 of the current employment level. Cool, Alex. Great. And then sort of coming away slightly from the sort of green job specific question is to look at the overall net impact on the economy, on jobs overall, rather than just green jobs. So you see here that if you look at what you've effectively got is 2 snapshots. So if you look at the estimated number of jobs in central London in 2030 and the estimated jobs in central London in 2050, and you compare the numbers from whether you have net zero policies in place, whether you don't have net zero policies in place, and you can see that with net zero policies there is a small, relatively small, but small positive overall impact on the number of total jobs in the economy. And there's effectively 3 kind of things driving this, right? The first is that stimulus effect. The transition to a low carbon economy means that before 2030, before 2050, you need to bring forward investment into a lot of technologies that stimulates economic demand. The other thing is that there's the savings to be made ultimately from energy efficiency with a lot of the net zero policies and a lot of green policies. And finally, that electricity prices are expected to fall as a result of economies of scale being achieved for low carbon energy technologies, and that as well also has a boost to GDP and employment as a consequence. Okay, thanks, Alex. But there's also this question of high carbon intense jobs. We talked about this a little bit more, but clearly in London there are a significant number of jobs, but lower than other parts of the country. the reason that you're probably seeing this concentration really in central, sorry, the under concentration in central London of high carbon intensive jobs is because of its big service sector effectively. Okay, great. And then just to kind of wrap up a little bit some of that. Overall, there is this big rise in green jobs. Some people will lose them. We think overall there's a net positive effect on overall employment. Current provision needs to change to meet future skills needs. There's an opportunity here to deliver inclusive growth, but there's also there's a need to manage to ensure there's a just transition as well. The sort of the asks here are increasing education provision in the relevant subjects, but then also making sure that more people from those subjects are going into green employment, and also looking at how you reskill people from other green sectors. These are sort of the asks here. Obviously, none of these are particularly straightforward. And overall, sort of underpinning all of this is a need for long-term policy clarity and certainty to support the London boroughs that we looked at, but as well as employers, their trade bodies, training providers, others to work together to address some of these matters. Alex, there's one more. And then, what can local government do now? As a sort of from a sort of policy perspective, I'm really big on the role of local government in all of this. This is an onion you can see on the right that we adapted from something that the Climate Change Committee prepared as part of its advice to local authorities with the 6th carbon budget. And you can see here sort of the really important things that local authorities get involved with that are central to delivering net zero. It's also just key that local authorities are heavily involved because there's lots of things that need to be coordinated based on an area's particular characteristics, and I think local authorities and sub-national bodies are in a really important place to do that. Drawing on their existing networks, drawing on local expertise, etc. But to do that effectively needs an evidence base, and we think that's where some of these approaches and techniques come in. Okay, so I think that's all. As I say, very happy to take questions now, and also very happy to have a subsequent chat with anyone if of interest.
Thanks very much, Joe. So we finished the presentation almost exactly on time. Any questions from the audience? Feel free to put them in the chat or put your hand up and I can unmute you. If there's no questions. More than happy to let you carry on with your days. Here we go. How does this stack up against the government's own projections?
So I'm just staying on. I've done something to my Zoom. Can you all hear me though?
Yeah.
I'm sort of like within a few different screens. As I say, I mean, we've a lot of the work that we've done to inform our own projections is very much based on the climate work that's been commissioned by the Climate Change Committee, and will have informed them as well. So we're sort of happy with that. How it stacks up with any government projections in with the net zero strategy or others, I'm not sure. Or, as I say, there are a number of other definitions of green jobs that the government use as well. So you need to take that into account.
Can you see the other questions, Joe, or do you need me to? So there's a.
Well, one is, are there any similar case studies for the north? I think we could probably update people on that in due course. There's various areas where we're looking at really. So yeah, we would obviously like to do this sorts of work across the country because we think that local insight and local data is really, really important.
Yeah, we can probably talk about the project that's going on now. I think it's a. Can we talk about the one we just started? I think so, probably. So we're doing the West Yorkshire Combined Authority, which is obviously very topical for. This has been part of Leeds Digital Festival, so that work is started. It's a public tender, so I guess we're allowed to sort of at least mention that we've started that work.
Yeah. So
that will come out in due course. Joe, you were just working on the timeline for that actually this week.
Right? Indeed, yeah. So that certainly would be working on that for the next few months, probably towards the end of this year.
So I got another question here, which is what can we prepare from a professional skill set perspective to skill up ourselves? Well, that's from Lily Fu. That was just above the similar case studies question. Yeah.
I'm not sure who who we is here.
Yeah, so depends who you are, doesn't it?
It depends who you are in terms of your professional skill set. I mean, clearly there's lots of different skill sets that are required here. So yeah, it would have to it would slightly depend on the perspective you're talking from. There's one here about supply chain needing certainty in order to invest in education and skills, and how much certainty is possible. I think that's something that we've heard a lot about when we did the London work. Particularly our partners on that one, IES and others, speaking to education and training providers, and also just speaking to boroughs and other stakeholders. I'll go back to the low carbon heating point because I think it's a personal example. We do have an overall heat and building strategy. We do have some sort of policies that come underneath that, but there's this sort of decision that's going to come in a few years of actually, okay, which way are we really going to go on hydrogen as a low carbon heating source? Is clean hydrogen going to be something that's going to be done at scale? Are we going big on heat pumps? And that kind of uncertainty means that businesses don't have the sort of confidence to invest significantly a lot in innovation in some of these areas, in building capacity in some of these areas, and that means that you don't that then doesn't feed into our sort of demand-led skills system, which then provides the signal for those to scale up for the relevant courses, etc. So it really, we think a lot of this does come from central government, because those of that's, I think, the organisation that's got the resources and some of the levers here to affect change. That then comes down to once we have some certainty at the national level, that can then feed down to more local actors who can take the important implementation actions within that to support businesses and support education and training providers.
Yes, I heard a rumour that Leeds is possibly going to test hydrogen through the gas system as a pilot somewhere, but I have no idea whether it's true or happening, but somebody did mention it to me. So that would make super topical.
Yeah, controversial topic, like hydrogen as a low carbon heating source, but yeah, the importance is a decision one way or the other.
Yeah. Natalie's question. So Daniel's got a question. I speak to dozens of construction companies.
Refuse to believe anything about it because they believe things will change. I can't blame them either. I mean, I think, obviously there's difficult questions to be made here by the government, and I don't think anyone kind of envies them to be making big decisions around such a big societal transformation. But ultimately, you can see, I think particularly there's been some, sort of stop-starty type things in the past. We saw the sort of what happened with the Green New Deal, what happened with feed-in tariffs that there is among the sort of labour-intensive kind of construction sector. There's probably maybe a bit of a trust issue as well, and so I think signals need to be very strong and very consistent from central government to encourage the right behaviours. Alex, I think that's one for you. Yeah,
Chris. So but basically the way our technology works copes with a lot of those challenges itself. So we use website text to classify business activities using machine learning. So I have no idea how familiar you are with concepts of machine learning, so I'll assume a very low level and hopefully not patronize anybody too much. But essentially, rather than saying here is classification, is a company part of the sector or not, you're able to say here is a classification for a sector, and here are really good examples of companies that we know are in that sector. And then we use their website text to build a machine learning classifier, which then looks at the website of any other company and asks how similar it is to the companies that we know are in the sector. And then as those companies change their websites, and they do that in accordance with the technology challenges and shifts in technology that you've alluded to in your question, it self-maintains the classifier. So they update their website text, that teaches the classifier that the sector's own language is changing, but the company's business activity is still focused on the objective, which is this sort of mission-led approach that we were talking about earlier, which makes sure that we're constantly keeping pace with the shifts in the sector. Hope that helps.
I should say, just from our perspective, that I think this is one of the we would feel very drawn to the Data City as a partner on this, because I think anyone who works in public policy will be familiar with the complaints about SIT codes as preventing us from doing a lot of meaningful public policy analysis, frankly, any economic policy analysis. So yeah, very useful partnership from a policy perspective.
Cool. Any more questions? There we go. So I mean, I think that's Jack's question is sort of the nub of the challenge, isn't it? I think what you picked up on there is it's what we've basically presented today is the first step in that in solving that. So we've tried to set a regional analysis against the national data set across a range of so sectoral activity, jobs and skills, and policy. And then from the evidence-based position, we're now moving into the next step, which is exactly what you've highlighted in your question, which is, okay, and that's at a regional basis, what does the destruction of jobs look like, or the change of jobs look like versus the local supply chain issues? But it's actually, I won't say hyper-local, but certainly local, regional challenge.
Absolutely. I should say on that point about job quality, I think overall, I mean, there's some work I think that we do draw on for ours. There was some by a think tank called Onward, who do some great work on the space. That suggests that I think you are looking at probably overall higher paid jobs in some of the green sectors, but with that high pay comes higher skills requirements ultimately, which I think just goes back to come in and say there's a big prize here, but that means getting the dance around skills provision and employment right, and that means ultimately a good evidence base.
Okay. Any more? If that's it, I think we can probably wrap up. So thank you very much, Joe. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending.
Thanks, everyone.
Oh, we've got one more. Tom, given you mention of political economy, what are the key government policy gaps that relate to low, medium, and high scenarios?
Interesting. I mean, I think you've got to look at how does I mean, it should be said that the scenarios, obviously there's a lot of things feeding into the need to have 3 different scenarios. Clearly policy of one of them, central government policy is one of them. Also, we have seen with the crisis in Ukraine and broader supply chain issues that the economics of gas and energy have changed dramatically in the space of days. So there's those uncertainties as well. But clearly, I think you've got to look at some of the very high employment sectors nationally, and how does government policy relate to those? I think is where you can see that policy is going to have a big impact on employment, and that comes down to things like low carbon heating and retrofit at the end of the day, and as well as a couple of other areas.
Okay, thank you, Joe. Anybody else? Right, I think we might be it. Anyone going to sneak in? If it is, then we'll just say thank you very much. And you've got our email addresses. We're on the last slide there. Or you can contact me via the Eventbrite message there if anybody wants to get in touch with any more questions, or indeed is interested in looking at evidence-based production. Please don't hesitate to drop us a line. All right. Thanks very much, Chris. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers. Bye-bye.